The scent of lavender and warm yeast hung in the air, perfect and heavy. My flagship restaurant, the Velvet Anchor, was finally open. I had spent 6 months curating every detail, from the reclaimed oak bar to the cello playlist humming softly in the background. It was a masterpiece of atmosphere, and in the center of it all sat the VIP table. The clock on the wall read exactly 8:15 in the evening when my phone buzzed right in my apron pocket. I pulled it out expecting an apology text or some cheap excuse about Boston traffic being a complete nightmare. Instead, the screen refreshed and a social media notification lit up the glass. It was a post from my brother Tyler. He had uploaded a selfie at a luxury sky lounge across town. He was holding an expensive drink, grinning widely, and flanked on either side by my parents, Gary and Patricia. The background wasn't an unexpected delay. It was a private terrace under glowing neon lights, celebrating what Tyler called his next corporate milestone. The caption read, "Real moves happen here. Big things coming soon." I stared at the screen, and the illumination didn't trigger a single tear. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. My eyes stayed dry. A chef knows that excess moisture ruins a delicate texture, and tonight required absolute precision. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, always funding their emotional deficits, while my own milestones were pushed aside. Now, I realized it had been nothing more than a bad subscription model, with me footing the bill while they enjoyed the premium features. My compassion had been a luxury resource, and they had overdrafted it for decades. I didn't ask why they had chosen a deliberate boycott over showing up for my grand opening. I didn't type a furious response. I simply closed the app, walked out from the kitchen, and stood before the pristine VIP table in the center of the dining room. It was dressed in imported white linen, set with my finest polished crystal, and completely vacant. I reached down, picked up the custom-etched sign marked "Reserved for Family," and applied pressure with both thumbs. The sharp, dry crack of the polished oak echoed through the high ceilings of the empty room. The sound was small, but it felt like a gunshot, clearing out a heavy, suffocating smog. Some ties do not need to be untied, they simply need to be severed with structural finality. This wasn't an emotional breakdown, it was a balance sheet adjustment. A young couple was waiting by the front door, looking hopeful but hesitant. As they glanced at the crowd, I caught the hostess's eye and waved them directly over to the center of the floor. I pulled out the chairs for them myself. "This table is open," I told them, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "It has the best view in the house." As they sat down, looking absolutely delighted by the unexpected upgrade, I unlocked my phone one last time. I opened my direct messages and typed a single sentence to my father. "Table is open to paying customers, do not bother coming." I didn't wait for the incoming wave of defensive typing or the predictable texts trying to rewrite the narrative. I completely powered down the device, sliding it into the back office drawer. I returned to the kitchen line, focusing my entire mind on the temperature of the stainless steel surfaces and the structural integrity of the plating. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. Inside, the restaurant hummed with a different kind of baseline clarity, a quiet retribution made entirely of numbers, facts, and the sudden realization that the bank of my obedience was permanently closed. The success of tonight was built on the back of my very first shop, the Gilded Crumb, a necessary stepping stone that allowed me to eventually scale my vision into this harborfront empire. But standing tonight beneath the handcrafted copper lights of this expansive dining room, looking out at the cold harbor air, my mind went directly back to the brutal accounting ledger of the last 15 years. 15 years of grueling 4 a.m. wake-up calls, deep kitchen burns permanently scoring my forearms, and heavy flour dust settling into my lungs. While my family spent every single summer on lavish vacations, I spent mine working exhausting double shifts at a commercial facility, punishing my body to save every penny. I had used the proven cash flow of my first shop and $120,000 in liquid collateral to secure a $2 million commercial expansion loan entirely on my own merit. My family never saw the terrifying amount of grit it required to amass that level of baseline solvency. To Gary and Patricia, my agonizing labor was just a predictable background utility, a cute little hobby I played with, while my brother Tyler was busy being their celebrated visionary. This is the profound psychological trap of a cruel, normalized family system. When a narcissistic dynamic hardens, the family creates an artificial hierarchy where the golden child can do no wrong, and the scapegoat exists solely to absorb the systemic pressure. My parents didn't see my sacrifice because they had spent decades normalizing my exploitation. In their minds, my structural stability wasn't an achievement, it was an unpaid emergency reserve, one they believed they had a birthright to tap whenever Tyler's latest venture inevitably crashed. My mother, Patricia, would wave her hand and say, "Olivia is so steady," as if being steady was just a generic consolation prize for being entirely boring. They never saw the white-hot fire it required to be steady in a house built completely on shifting sand. Most people looking at my history from the outside would question why I stayed so long, why I kept footing the bill for Tyler's expenses, buying his groceries, and nodding politely while my own identity gathered dust. They do not understand the invisible, suffocating chains that bind a survivor. Growing up under Gary's roof was a masterclass in psychological conditioning, a slow process of learned helplessness where your autonomy is systematically eroded until you believe you have no choice but to comply. I wasn't funding their lifestyle because I was weak. I was using compliance as a temporary shield. My early obedience was a cold, quiet strategy of survival, a mandatory tax I paid to keep the peace, while I secretly built my own exit route. I was the hidden engine running their entire narrative, but they genuinely believed I was just a convenient asset they could leverage forever. They were not shocked by the cruelty of their abandonment at my opening. They were merely terrified that their cash cow had finally learned how to lock the gate. The prep kitchen of the Velvet Anchor always smells like fresh rosemary, charred oak, and heavy potential before the sun completely clears the harbor. I was working the line, checking the inventory levels on the lobster station, when the heavy, authoritative footsteps rattled the floorboards. I didn't need to look toward the entrance to know who had crossed my threshold. My father, Gary, strode into my restaurant with the unearned confidence of a man who believed every piece of real estate he walked on belonged to him. He was wearing his tailored corporate casual polo shirt, the uniform he adopted when he wanted to project immense executive importance without ever lifting a single finger. He didn't look at the handcrafted copper accents, the custom walnut tables, or the pristine execution of my dining floor. He looked straight at me, his eyes narrowing as he scanned my posture for any visible fracture lines of compliance. He leaned heavily against the marble pass, letting out a dismissive huff of air. "Look, about your little opening night," he began, his voice dripping with that familiar condescension I had grown up hearing. "We didn't mean to ignore your project, Olivia, but Tyler had a massive strategic breakthrough at the Sky Lounge. Some serious venture capitalists were at that table. We had to protect the family's primary investment. It was baseline networking. This restaurant is nice, clearly, but it is small potatoes compared to the global app Tyler is engineering to launch." He paused, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to ask about his brilliant son's capital requirements. I kept my face an absolute wall. I didn't say a word. I just kept slicing the raw tuna with clinical precision. "Listen to me carefully, Olivia," Gary continued, his voice dropping to a low, manipulative whisper. "We think it's time you diversified your assets. Tyler needs an immediate transfer of $100,000 to secure his ground floor equity. Consider it an investment in the family structure. We accommodated this culinary phase of yours when you were just playing with pots in the kitchen. Now, it is your turn to support your brother's genius. Don't be completely selfish." I set the knife down flat against the stainless steel table. This wasn't a request for help. It was an aggressive demand for tribute. The scale of their entitlement was staggering. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was dangerously calm. The bank is permanently closed, Gary. I am not an unpaid asset to be harvested for Tyler's failures. His paternal mask shattered instantly, revealing the raw, ugly bully underneath. His face turned a deep, furious purple as he lunged forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me over the counter. "You ungrateful little bitch," he hissed, his teeth clenched tight. "You owe us everything. We fed you. We raised you. If you don't sign that capital authorization, I will ensure this little playground of yours is burned to the bedrock. Don't think you can survive without my blessing." The confrontation left a toxic residue in the air, one that no amount of citrus cleaner could scrub away. The silence of the empty kitchen didn't last. Within 2 sunrises, during our absolute peak midday lunch service, the true retaliation materialized. The dining room was completely packed, tickets printing consecutively, the rhythm of the kitchen running at peak performance. Then the heavy front door chimed, and the entire atmosphere curdled into ice. 2 health officials in dark state windbreakers strode in, flashing badges and demanding an immediate, unannounced emergency inspection of the preparation line. They announced loudly to the entire room that they had received an urgent, anonymous tip from a concerned relative who had personally witnessed a severe rodent infestation in my dry storage vault. I didn't panic. I stood with my arms crossed, watching the inspector tear my facility apart for 45 minutes. He checked the refrigeration logs, the temperature seals, and the spaces behind the high-end industrial ranges. My staff stood frozen, but I remained an absolute wall of clinical detachment. Finally, he clicked his pen close and handed me the clean report. He admitted it was one of the most pristine facilities he had seen all year, a complete false alarm. Then, he let slip that the anonymous caller had explicitly claimed to be a concerned relative who had seen the contamination personally. A relative. I forced a polite smile for the remaining guests as he exited, but the second the front door closed, the mask came off. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was an act of public economic arson. They were willing to burn my livelihood to the bedrock just to force me into absolute submission. I walked straight into my back office and pulled up the security camera feeds from yesterday afternoon. I rewound the timeline, watching the digital timestamp tick backward. Sure enough, there it was. Tyler's car was idling across the street for 20 minutes during our heaviest lunch rush. I watched my own brother casing the establishment, counting the customers, calculating how much damage a fraudulent report would cause to the business I had bled for. My hands didn't shake with fear. They tightened with a cold, absolute clarity. You do not mess with an executive chef's kitchen. You do not weaponize a state agency against a sovereign enterprise. That is a declaration of nuclear war, and I was entirely done treating criminals like family members. This is the moment of absolute awakening for the designated family scapegoat. For years, you operate under the heavy delusion that if you just work harder, if you just remain reliable, the family system will eventually protect you. But the dark truth of structural family abuse is that your abusers do not see you as a human being. They see you as a baseline extraction site, waiting for their remorse or hoping they will suddenly develop a conscience is a slow financial and emotional suicide. If I didn't act immediately with cold, professional precision, their parasitic malice would completely erode everything I had built. A world without an unyielding boundary is a world where abusers dismantle your future to pay for their own collapse and ruin. My compassion had to be completely locked away to preserve my sovereign ground. I picked up the landline and dialed a corporate litigation firm. I didn't call Gary to argue, and I didn't text Tyler to complain. This wasn't a time for emotion, it was a time for accounting. I spent the next 2 hours on a secure call with my attorney, walking through every financial receipt, every property deed, and every corporate record attached to the velvet anchor. We began building an unyielding legal firewall around my commercial assets, stripping away any historic entry points they assumed they possessed. I cut off all raw emotional contact, instructing my management team to document every single interaction with clinical detail. I wasn't just preparing a standard defense. I was constructing a total siege protocol. If they wanted to play corporate warfare, I was going to introduce them to the full weight of the law. The kitchen lights were dimmed to a low amber hum when the knock sounded against the rear security entrance. It was exactly midnight. I checked the security monitor and saw Jenna Tyler's pregnant fiancé standing in the rain, looking like an absolute ghost. I unlocked the heavy steel door, but left the safety latch engaged. Her face was completely pale, and her voice fractured as she begged me to listen. She admitted she couldn't go to the authorities alone, but she absolutely refused to raise a child inside a family dynamic that systematically devours its own members to protect an empty pedestal. She slid her mobile device through the narrow gap, her hands trembling violently against the reinforced frame. She played an encrypted voice recording. The audio was grainy, but the raw, clinical entitlement in my father's tone was unmistakable. Tyler didn't have elite venture capitalists backing his tech project. He was drowning in high-stakes gambling debts, totaling $850,000 to dangerous street bookies. The initial demand for money had been a direct emergency ransom, not a baseline startup investment. But it was the macro strategy on the file that turned my blood completely to absolute ice. They were actively conspiring to exploit an unrevoked corporate guarantee clause from my very first business structure, a legal loophole I had completely failed to decouple during my flagship expansion to the Seaport District. On the recording, Gary was calmly mapping out a forced liquidation of the Velvet Anchor to cover the deficit. They estimated my high-end commercial kitchen equipment, the handcrafted copper infrastructure, and the custom walnut fixtures were worth at least $1.5 million on the liquidation market. Gary's voice carried a chilling stillness when he told Tyler that I was highly resilient, that I was historically good at starting over from nothing, and that a baseline baker could always secure a low-level job at a regional grocery store chain. This is the ultimate realization of the golden child paradox. When the source of unearned utility dries up, the parasite does not develop a conscience. It escalates directly into severe criminal predation. They arrived at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, carrying leather briefcases that functioned as standard corporate props. Gary and Tyler looked incredibly smug, completely convinced they were about to sign a mandatory restructuring contract with a broken, desperate daughter. I unlocked the front doors and let them step into the center of my dining room floor. Gary placed the thick stack of papers on the marble pass, telling me with a practiced, fraudulent sigh that it was time to rebrand and wipe the slate clean after the unfortunate safety inspection. Tyler was already looking past my shoulder, mentally logging the serial numbers on my espresso lines, calculating the exact resale value of my life's work. I didn't reach for a pen. Instead, I bypassed their paperwork, touched my phone screen, and connected it directly to the restaurant's premium commercial sound system. Suddenly, Tyler's frantic, recorded voice filled the entire multi-level space, booming with high-fidelity accuracy through every speaker. The exact words detailing their asset-stripping conspiracy rattled the crystal fixtures. The remaining color drained from Tyler's face so fast he looked like he might lose consciousness on the spot, and Gary froze mid-sentence, his hand suspended over the desk. Armed with the warrants issued from Jenna's evidence the prior night, 2 fraud detectives stepped out from my secure back office, placing them both under immediate arrest for felony conspiracy. I watched the towering figures of my childhood as they were led away, and they didn't look like monsters anymore. They just looked like small, overdrawn men drowning in the facts of their own calculation. 14 months later, after a grueling federal investigation and a relentless courtroom battle, the destruction of their malicious network was absolute. Gary and Tyler's high-priced attorneys tried desperately to negotiate a confidential settlement, but the voice recordings and certified financial records left them with zero leverage. Tyler was convicted of felony fraud, conspiracy, his unearned confidence dissolving into a prison sentence, while Gary faced the total loss of the commercial assets he had tried so ruthlessly to steal. Patricia left completely isolated in the empty shell of their manufactured status, watched her entire social circle evaporate as the public record laid bare. The decades of systematic exploitation they had inflicted on their own daughter. They had built their lives on an illusion of hierarchy, and the moment the scapegoat walked away, the entire structure crumbled to absolute ash. But I refused to let my life be defined by their ruin. I chose the justice of a seed planter, understanding that true victory isn't about watching your abusers burn. It is about building something so beautiful that their malice becomes completely irrelevant. I used a portion of my surging profits to establish a dedicated foundation, a sovereign sanctuary providing legal protection, culinary scholarships, and commercial resources for young artisans trying to break free from extractive family environments. I was no longer a backup plan or an unpaid safety net. I was the architect of my own empire, surrounded by a chosen family built not on the accident of blood, but on mutual respect, shared passion, and unyielding decency. The velvet anchor overflowed with life, the dining room humming with the rich, deep warmth of authentic connection. On a quiet Tuesday evening, the city's most notorious culinary critic, a man famous for destroying establishments with a single sentence, sat anonymously near the harbor windows. He didn't leave a typical tip. Instead, that Sunday, his front page review in the city's leading paper completely cemented our legacy. Right beneath a 5-star rating, scrawled in bold print, were the words that replaced 15 years of family gaslighting. Integrity tastes better than anything. I framed that Sunday edition and hung it proudly on the wall, a brilliant emblem of earned merit standing exactly where their apology should have been. I've come to realize that the hardest part of escaping a toxic home isn't the wealth you must build from nothing. It's the unearned guilt you must learn to leave behind. For decades, I believed that my obedience was the price of admission for love, and that setting a boundary made me a selfish daughter. But the truth is, choosing yourself is an act of survival, not cruelty. If you find yourself in a similar situation today, sitting at a family table where your talent is minimized and your boundaries are treated like a tantrum, remember that you do not owe your loyalty to a system designed to keep you small. Sometimes, the most profound forgiveness you can offer is to close the door permanently, because protecting your own peace is the only way to set yourself completely free. If you've ever had to build your own table because your family wouldn't give you a seat, share this story. You are not alone.